Common source of confusion that occurs in math classes is the difference between equations and expressions. And I want to talk about which one's which and how you can tell the difference and what's going to be expected. What types of problems involve equations, what types of problems involve expressions. First of all, let's do some examples of expressions. Examples of expressions will be something like this. If we just had x plus 2, or if we had, say, x minus 5x plus 7 plus 2x. Or we could have something like x squared plus 3 times x plus 1. Or we don't even have to have a variable or a letter in there. We could have, say, 3 halves minus 7. These are all expressions. Notice that they don't have any equal signs in them. And we're going to contrast that with examples of equations. Equations are always going to have an equal sign. So we could have, say, x plus 2 equals 0, or say 7x minus 4 equals 17. It could be something even more complicated, say x times x minus 4 minus 3x equals 2/3 x plus 1. So these are examples of equations. Notice that they all have an equal sign in the middle. We're working with equations. Typically, what you're asked to do is to solve the equation. So you want to find what x is. When you're working with expressions, you're usually asked to simplify. So let's go through some examples and talk a little bit more about why these are different. When you're working with expressions, notice that you have no equal sign. You're usually asked to simplify or reduce an expression. So if you have a problem with an expression, usually the instructions are to simplify or reduce. And then you'll have, if you have a variable in your expression, like this x up here, what that represents is sort of like a placeholder, or it could be an arbitrary number. So variables like x, they can be viewed as placeholders or can be thought of as and I'm running out of room, as an arbitrary number. So these are sort of the 3 bullet points we have for expressions. Equations, on the other hand, we have an equal sign in the middle. If you can still see this one up here, right? We've got that equals in the middle. So equations always have an equal sign. When you're given an equation as a homework problem, usually what you're asked to do is to solve the equation. So with expressions, you're asked to simplify or reduce. With equations, you're usually asked to solve. And then when you have a variable in an equation, like an x or a y or something, usually what that means is you want to solve for that variable. So in something like this, what x represents is some number, and we don't know what that number is, but we want to figure out what that number is by solving this equation up here. So variables like x are unknowns. That you want to solve for. So these are kind of the big differences between expressions and equations. And even though it seems kind of obvious, right, expressions there's no equal sign, equations there's always an equal sign, there tends to be quite a bit of confusion with this. Very often I see students changing equations into expressions or vice versa, or they're treating an expression like it's an equation. They set it equal to 0 when it's just an expression. And I want to just sort of briefly go over a couple simple examples of how do we simplify expressions, how do we answer questions involving expressions, how do we answer questions involving equations. So let's do a couple examples of expressions. Suppose we're asked to simplify something like x minus 2 times 3x minus 4. First of all, this is an expression, there's no equal sign in it, and we're asked to simplify this expression. So we'd start out, we would write out the expression x minus 2 times 3x minus 4. And then we start using the basic properties of algebra and arithmetic to simplify this. First, we need to use the distributive property. I picked this example because we have this minus 2 and minus 4. People oftentimes make errors with the negative numbers in problems like this. So we would have this is equal to x minus, so I have negative 2 times 3x, that would be minus 6x. Then we have negative 2 times negative 4, so that would be plus 8. And then I have x minus 6x, that gives me negative 5x plus 8, and then we're done. Right? You can't simplify that any further. Notice when I did this, I worked vertically. I have this equal sign here, then I went down, have this equal sign here. Working vertically like this, where your equal signs are always aligned, makes it much easier to read, makes your work much more legible. I would strongly encourage you to do that on your homework. Sometimes people just sort of bounce around putting things wherever they are, wherever they want. Don't do that. You want to make sure you connect your work with equal signs. What I see fairly often are things like this, x minus 2 times 3x minus 4, and then say x minus 6x plus 8, and then down somewhere else I'd see a negative 5x plus 8, and then that might be circled as the answer. If you do that on the homework, I'll probably mark you down. You have to organize your work. You can't, I just don't want a list of random expressions scattered throughout your homework. I need to see how things are connected. If you write things like this up here, I can see how your work's connected, right? You're connecting your work with the equal signs and you're using them correctly. With this, it's difficult to follow your work. An important thing in this class is being able to communicate your ideas, not just getting the right answer. Let's now do an example where we're working with solving an equation. Suppose we're asked to solve for x plus 3 equals 5/3 minus 2x. Notice we have an equation here, not an expression. With this, we have these x's here. What that means is we want to find values of x so that if we plug those values of x into this equation, we get a true statement. And so that's what we mean when we solve. We want to find out what values of x, what can we plug in for x that makes this true. If we go scroll up real quick, simplifying, what we're doing here is, right, x can be any number. Right, if I plug in x as 5 here, this will be equal to negative 5 times 5 plus 8. If I plug in x as a billion into here, look at the same thing here, right? X is just a placeholder. X can be any number when we're working with this expression here. And any number over here, we can let x be anything, and these guys will be equal to each other. Right? That's what we talked about before. With expressions, this x is just a placeholder. You can think of it as being an arbitrary number. With an equation like this, x can't be any number. We want to find specific values of x that make this a true statement. So let's go through and solve this. First thing I would do is add 2x to both sides of the equation. This will give me 6x plus 3 equals 5/3. Next step, I'd subtract 3 from both sides of the equation. 6x equals 5/3 minus 3. Need to get a common denominator, so this is 5/3 minus 9/3, so 6x equals negative 4/3. To solve for x, we can now multiply both sides of the equation by 1/6 or divide both sides of the equation by 6. Sometimes people have problems dividing involving fractions, so I'm going to divide both sides of the equation by 6, just to do an example of that. So divide both sides of the equation by 6, x equals negative 4/3 divided by 6. To simplify something like that, what we would do is multiply the numerator and the denominator by 3, right? We aren't changing anything, we're just multiplying by 1. So multiply by 3 divided by 3. Negative 4/3 times 3. 3's cancel out. We just have negative 4 left over in the numerator. 6 times 3 is 18. And we end up with x equals, we reduce this fraction, that would be x equals negative 2/9. Notice that when I did this, I had equal signs that were aligned, working vertically. Again, that just makes your work much more legible, easier to read. I would encourage you to do that whenever you're working with equations. Work vertically, connect them, try to have your equal signs somewhat in the middle. You can see, let's scroll up, don't have quite enough room, but you can see I just start off with this in the middle, just sort of work my way down, and I end up with x equals negative 2/9. Make sure you don't change your equations into expressions. That happens fairly often. People will just forget one side and work on the other side for a while, sort of back and forth. Make sure you include both sides. When you're working with equations, you should always have an equal sign. When I solve for this x down here, what that means is if I took this x, this negative 2/9, substituted it into the original equation, the left-hand side and the right-hand side would be equal. I'm not going to check the answer. If you've got some extra time on your hands, you're more than welcome to plug that in. Make sure that this side is equal to this side. And that's what happens when you're working with equations. With expressions, again, when you're simplifying things, x is more of just a placeholder. Here, x is an unknown that we want to solve for. This is something that seems kind of obvious, this equations versus expressions, but lots of people make this confusion. As always, let me know if you have any questions. I can try and help you out.